The Taliban talks peace with Americans while murdering Afghans. A deadly attack in Kabul kills 6 people and injures more than 100 others. I'm Imran Garda, and today on The Newsmakers we ask if it's time to stop talking to the Taliban while they continue to kill. After almost 20 years of war and 30,000 civilian deaths, Afghanistan is desperately seeking stability. For many, the main obstacle to peace is the Taliban. For decades, they've launched attack after attack and killed thousands. But at the same time, they've engaged in numerous negotiations to end the violence. So, has it all been a waste of time? Monday's attack in the capital took place while the militant group was taking part in the latest round of peace talks with the US. It begs the question, can the Taliban be trusted in negotiations? Or is it maybe time to return to a more hardline approach to end this decades-old conflict? That debate in a moment, but first, Adam Pletz has this report.
This is the aftermath of a truck bombing claimed by the Taliban in Kabul on Monday.
I don't know how many people were killed. I just managed to escape as the situation was very tense.
Early estimates suggested a death toll above 40. That's since been revised down to 6, but more than 100 people are injured. The Taliban says the target was the defense ministry, but most of the wounded are civilians, including more than 50 children from nearby schools.
It was a terrible situation, and everyone was scared. I threw myself out of the car window. My face was covered in blood, and I injured my hand.
The attack took place as US and Taliban delegations held a 7th round of talks in Qatar, aimed at bringing an end to the 18-year conflict. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo visited Afghanistan just a week before to outline his hopes for an agreement.
I hope we have a peace deal before September 1st. That's certainly our mission set. All sides agree that finalizing a US-Taliban understanding on terrorism and foreign troop presence will open the door to intra-Afghan dialogue and negotiation.
He's confirmed that the US will withdraw its military from Afghanistan, but not when it will do so. Yet Kabul continues to rely on security assistance from Washington, which still has 14,000 troops stationed in the country. The Taliban now controls, or contests, more territory than at any point since 2001. It's warned that until all foreign fighters have left, it will not engage in peace talks with the government, which many Afghans believe are long overdue.
We hope for lasting peace in the country and an end to the current conflict. Everyone is fed up with war and wants to live a better life.
But as the Taliban flaunts its disregard for civilian life in cynically timed attacks, is negotiating with the group tantamount to condoning terrorism, or is it the only route to peace? Adam Pletz, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Omar Samad. He's a former Afghan ambassador and was a spokesman for the Afghan Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Good to have you back on the program, sir. A new attack by the Taliban while they're talking to the United States in Doha. Do you expect them to continue to do this, attack while talk?
Unfortunately, and if you look at the history, these types of attacks do take place when negotiations are taking place because either one side or all sides want to gain leverage for the talks, for political advantage, trying to send messages as signals. And it's a tragedy when civilians and innocent people are on the crossroad, the crossways, and get hurt. But I think that this process is reaching a certain stage that is critical at this point. Attacks are taking place on all sides. All sides are engaged in escalated form of violence and fighting over this fighting season. It started a few months ago. First initially initiated by the Taliban, then the government responded. And so it's been a very bloody season, unfortunately, for the Afghan people. But talks aiming at peace, and a peace that is durable, a peace that is inclusive, a peace that is just, is one way to resolve this problem. And I think that we are at a stage, as I said earlier, where it's going to be critical to see how this peace is going to take shape, what it involves, and what the results might be, depending on the politics and the geopolitics, very complex situation that surrounds Afghanistan.
But of course, you say there have been attacks on all sides. Of course, with the Taliban, they're specifically targeting civilians, whereas the Afghan government and the coalition would say, well, we're not targeting civilians, but civilians are caught up in the crossfire. When this happens, while they're talking in Doha, undoubtedly this is embarrassing for Zalmay Khalilzad and everybody else who says, let's have the Taliban at the table and let's talk to them and let's come to a resolution. Will they be wrong if they decide we're going to walk away from the table because you continue to target civilians? Is it a bad idea for the US to walk away?
Well, you end up with different opinions about this, and we see that there are those who say we need to stop, halt, postpone, even cancel altogether, walk away. And there are those who are saying, no, you need to continue because there are more important things to be gained from this. At the end of the day, Afghanistan has been at war for 40 years. The past 18 years have seen all kinds of ups and downs and surges and ends of combat missions and beginning of combat missions, and nothing has really changed except for the fact that the enemy, in this case the Taliban, have gained more territory over time. There are more casualties, there are more body counts across the board, whether it's on this side or that side. And we need a political settlement for Afghanistan, and we need an end to this carnage and to this level of violence that Afghanistan is experiencing. Now, how do you do this? Right now, there's this one process. We haven't had a credible process. We haven't had a serious process at any moment in the past 18 years. This is the one that was started by the Americans because they're involved in this fight. And this is the one that involves the Taliban as well as many countries in the region. So I don't think that anyone is seriously considering throwing this away at this point or even postponing it, because we hear from other sources that at least the part of the deal between the Americans and the Taliban is now reaching some type of maybe culmination, and final stages are being worked on. So it has to, obviously, from a political point of view, continue. And those who advocate stopping it would have to have a very strong reason and an alternative to that, because that is not, in my opinion, sufficient enough reason, because fighting could continue despite talks, and it could be worse. At some point, we need to have a ceasefire. And the sooner we have a ceasefire, the better it is for all.
I know the Taliban is very active on social media. They watch and listen to what's being said about them and what's being said about Afghanistan. What's your message to the Taliban?
Well, my message to the Afghan Taliban who do not have ties to international terrorism and who are not part of an external agenda to subjugate Afghanistan is that Afghanistan is every Afghan's home. We have had this process where over the last 18 years, almost all elements are now within Afghanistan, part of the post-2001 structure. The Taliban are the only element out. They need to be incorporated. The ones who I said, fit that bill, they need to be incorporated in a way that is acceptable to the majority of Afghans, if not all Afghans. And it does not undermine the gains of the main and the essential gains of the past 18 years. We need a negotiated settlement. It is not going to be easy. It's going to be probably difficult and long. But at the same time, there's a certain level of responsibility that lies not only on the shoulders of the Taliban for what they need to do and need to make sure that they improve their credentials, but also on the side of the Afghan government and those who either want to pursue war, conflict for their own interest, or those who are doing it for political and power and continuation of power reasons, or for those who obviously have other ulterior motives. All sides need to realize that this is an opportunity. We cannot lose this opportunity. We have to make the best of it. But at the same time, the alternatives are not that great. And Afghanistan sliding back into a state of conflict, continuous war, as they call it, and endless war, is not a pretty sight and not something that the Afghan people in the majority want.
Ambassador Omar Samad, great to have you back on the program. Looking forward to chatting to you sometime soon. Well, to discuss this further, let's bring in our panel. Marzia Babarkhail is a former Supreme Court judge in Afghanistan. She was forced to flee after the Taliban made an attempt on her life. Diva Patang worked at the Afghan embassy in London. She's now a TV host for Radio Television Afghanistan. And in Annapolis, Maryland, is Michael Kugelman. He's the Deputy Director of the Asia Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Good to have you all joining us on the program. Marzia Babarkhail, are you as optimistic as Ambassador Omar Samad, who says, well, yes, these attacks might be terrible, but perhaps they're symptomatic of the Taliban trying to gain leverage because the peace talks are working and we're close to some sort of agreement with the United States? Do you share that optimism?
Thank you very much for having me. But about the peace process, especially that happening 2 days before in Afghanistan, we sacrificed the civilian children. I'm not very optimistic about the peace process in Afghanistan. You know, the cycle of violence must be stopped in Afghanistan. The people want peace, but never we want peace with killing people. We want peace with peace.
Diva Patang, is it a catch-22 situation for the Afghan people? Because if there's no deal, violence continues. If there is a deal, there are fundamental fears that absorbing the Taliban back into society means possibly accepting some of the terrible things that they want in everyday life that they had when they were in power. Is it a catch-22?
Well, first of all, when you say about deal, when it comes to peace, in peace there are, of course, deals will be made. But as we're talking about peace right now, we don't have no other choice other than just having a peace. Afghanistan doesn't have any other options but to talk to the Taliban. We had this mistake that we didn't include them in the Bonn conference at the beginning, and now we're facing all these issues. So I know that Marzia Babarkhail just right now mentioned that we want just peace and nothing other than peace. We have witnessed that a lot of other countries, as Colombia or other countries, they have been through this, the peace deals and the ceasefire, that any peace that you try to reach, there will be, of course, casualties. We will be having people dying from it. And if we don't actually have a peace, this war will continue. And as Ambassador Samad rightly mentioned, that and he has been very optimistic, and I would strongly agree with him.
Michael Kugelman, if the U.S. walks away now, what happens?
Well, I think that if the U.S. were to walk away, if it were to stop negotiating, and if it were to start pulling troops from Afghanistan, which President Trump really wants to do, you really have to worry in a big way about stability in Afghanistan. You really have to worry about things falling apart in a big way. This is not to say that maintaining U.S. troops in Afghanistan makes the country stable. I mean, clearly we see that's the case, and in fact, one thing that I find quite troubling is that in recent months, according to recent figures, the number of civilian casualties that have come at the hands of U.S. forces and Afghan forces and those allied to them has actually increased. So you could argue that, unfortunately, on some levels, a U.S. presence is even destabilizing. But above all else, clearly, there could be major problems if the U.S. were to pull out. Not only would it be a huge victory for the Taliban, putting it in a better position to scale up its fight, but it would also help these terror groups, particularly the ISIS faction in Afghanistan, to take advantage of the security vacuum and to become stronger. I would not overstate the strength of the ISIS faction in Afghanistan, but it's remained resilient, even though it's been hit hard by U.S. and Afghan strikes over the years.
Marzia, you have a very personal stake in this. The Taliban came after you very personally. Do you trust them at all to be able to make the compromises needed for peace?
No, never. I trust the Taliban. You know, the Taliban, when we go to the reality and we see the history of the Taliban, what they did in Afghanistan, we start to be nice with them and start the peace process. The peace process is not a competition, it's a peace process to bring peace in Afghanistan. we cannot ignore all the bad things about the Taliban. For me, and also I am behalf of people in Afghanistan, because I can feel the pain of mom. I can feel the pain of people. They lost their loved one. I am the behalf of the women. They sacrifice their lives in the Taliban regime. I cannot support the Taliban discussion and peace process.
Diva, the Taliban wants to wait it out. The Americans want to get out. With that in mind, they have the patience, and they seem to be a very robust organization that will use any methods at their disposal. Are you afraid for the future?
Of course, we are worried about the future of Afghanistan. U.S. has actually spent billions of pounds in Afghanistan to bring some stability and also to fight the terrorism. We have now the chance to talk. We are at the best time to talk to the Taliban and to negotiate a peace deal, because we cannot ignore the Taliban, because most of them are Afghans. But what is very, very important is, of course, for the Afghan government, is to include the opposition in the peace talk, because the opposition of the government and as well as the government, they need to work together to be able to make and come into a peace negotiation with the Taliban. Right now, what we are having U.S. talking to the Taliban, but we don't have a lot of interaction of the Afghan government, and we have some interaction of the opposition of talking to the Taliban. What they really needs to happen is the opposition and the Afghan government together to come into around one table and to come into compromise and talk to the Taliban to reach the peace deal, because we don't have no other option other than to join hands and agree with a peace deal. And I know that the ceasefire is extremely important. But when attacks such as in Kabul, what happened just 2 days ago, tragedies as such will actually have a huge impact on the peace deals, because it will bring trust issues, and it will bring and also the issues of not trusting each other, and as well as the discouragement of the peace deal.
Marzia Babakar Khail, will it make a difference if Ashraf Ghani got on a plane and went to Doha and the Afghan government was actually involved in those peace talks?
I think yes, because the peace talk should be with the government. Government is responsible. Also, the American government, they shouldn't ignore the government of Afghanistan, because there's the head of the country. For me, it will be a big change if they involve the government directly.
Michael Kugelman, looking at Trump's mindset and what he wants to achieve here, very revealing interview with Tucker Carlson, one of his preferred interviewers. He called Afghanistan the Harvard of terrorists. He said, I'd like to get out, or just get out. The problem is it just seems to be a lab for terrorists. I call it the Harvard of terrorists. And he said he wants to get out, but then he would leave very strong intelligence there, which is interesting because he sees everything purely through a security lens here. Does the US president have a strategy? And if so, does he have a good strategy?
Well, I mean, President Trump is so hard to predict because he changes his mind, and it's really hard to say exactly what he's thinking. My sense is he's never been comfortable staying in Afghanistan, even when he agreed to stay in Afghanistan. I think that for now, he's going to let the talks play out. But I think that if we get to a certain point, whether it's a few months or whatever the case may be, and the talks have not yielded the comprehensive peace agreement that the U.S. may want, he would not hesitate to try to zero option and all U.S. troops out, which, as I noted before, would be a disaster. The issue here is that the few senior officials in the White House that had his ear on issues like Afghanistan and who wanted to stay in Afghanistan, they're no longer in the White House. H.R. McMaster, the former National Security Advisor, former Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, they're gone. Very few people left in the White House that, quite frankly, I think are really passionate about Afghanistan and favor staying there. So that suggests that it could just be a matter of time before President Trump decides to withdraw, even if there's a deal. So I do think at this point that he does buy into terrorism argument,
Right.
that you need to keep a troop presence there in order to push back against the terrorism concern.
Marzia, do you have a message for President Trump?
My message will be for him, please change your mind. People in Afghanistan need peace and peaceful life. You know, we sacrificed all our life. We don't want to be, again, to sacrifice for other, like political agenda for other people in other countries. We need peace. Afghanistan people need future.
But do you believe that you will be abandoned if the United States just left immediately?
You know, the United States, they put a big budget for peace process. If really they want to help Afghanistan, they can give this budget, give this possibility to our military to become more in power. For me, it is, I think, should the government of Afghanistan, they give this answer. I think it's the best way. America should just make a clear agenda for Afghanistan.
Diva, as things stand, it seems as if the Afghan military, the Afghan security forces, does not have the firepower to fight the Taliban and Daesh and all the other groups. This is for Diva. So, Diva, with that in mind, is the practical thing to have the Americans stay for as long as they can?
Well, Americans, first of all, will be staying. They will not be going anywhere. They have spent huge amounts of money in Afghanistan. They are in Afghanistan for their own national interest. So it is for their national interest to stay in Afghanistan, even if they're talking to the Taliban, it's because of their own national interest. So if they leave Afghanistan today, they know that they will have security issues in America themselves. So if they are right now in Afghanistan and they are assisting, of course, our military and our security, but what really needs to change is how the neighboring countries are actually treated. And because most of them, the threats are coming to Afghanistan, and the civilians that are getting killed is due to the neighboring countries' involvement and a lot of connection to the terrorist network.
You mean
that,
Pakistan, Diva?
Well, that you can name it, but what I'm trying to say is that you've talked about Trump's strategy. Of course, he wants to leave Afghanistan and to show to the American people that because of elections is coming in the US, and he wants to win, and he wants to show that everything is fine in Afghanistan. But overall, if you think about it, the military in US, they don't want to leave Afghanistan because they know that if they leave Afghanistan, the security of their own country will actually be in a war situation. So the best thing for US to do is to change their strategy to how they are applying the pressure into to the neighboring countries around Afghanistan.
Marzia, there are young American soldiers being deployed to Afghanistan for their first tour of duty who weren't even alive when 9/11 happened, which was the reason many Americans went into Afghanistan. When they ask, what are we fighting for in Afghanistan, what would you tell them they're fighting for?
You know, it is not about the message for between Afghan people and American soldiers. I appreciate the American soldier and international soldier. They came in Afghanistan and they sacrificed as well. They bring peace. They keep the country safe, my country safe. And my message always be much appreciated all the things they do for Afghanistan. And Afghanistan needed till we stand in our power. The big movement in Afghanistan now, you know, the young generation is a big hope for Afghanistan. I think for me, anybody give any contribution in Afghanistan is a big thing for all Afghani people around the world.
Diva Patang, what are young Americans fighting for, if they had to ask you?
Well, they're fighting for their own security, to keep Americans safe. and to keep it away from things that happened like 9/11. This is what they're fighting for. But because they're fighting it here in Afghanistan, we have our own soldiers, our own security forces that they are dying. They are the front line. They are fighting not just for the Afghans to keep the land safe, but they're also fighting for all the international security. Because we are sacrificing every single day. Afghan security forces are dying. So it's not just the Americans who has lost, of course, a lot of their lives, and we have lost a lot of Afghan security forces too. So the fight that is happening right now is that they're fighting the international terrorism, which is the duty not just of our Afghan security, but it's the duty of worldwide, that it should be fought, and it should be fought as a jointly.
Diva Patang, Marzia Babakar Khail, and Michael Kugelman, great to have you on the Newsmakers. Thanks for joining us. We began this program looking at how to bring peace to Afghanistan after yet another deadly attack in the capital. That conversation is all the more timely considering it's now officially the least peaceful place on the planet. The 2019 Global Peace Index, published by the Institute for Economics and Peace, ranks Afghanistan last, below Syria. And with reports of conflict and crises raging across the globe, you'd easily think the world is less peaceful today than it was last year. But for the first time in 5 years, the Global Peace Index has actually improved. But how? Well, let's ask Steve Killilaire, who oversaw the report. He's the founder and executive chairman of the Institute for Economics and Peace. Steve, good to have you on the program. So a lot of people would look at that and ask, well, how and based on what metrics? For example, the first thing you do when you look at these lists, you look at where you come from and where your country ranks. I'm a South African and I live in Turkey, right? So I looked at the list and I saw that South Africa was 127th and Turkey is 152nd. And that's 25 positions lower than South Africa. And I thought, no, that can't be right, because I can walk around the streets of Turkish cities late at night and feel safe with my kids, but not really in South Africa. So is the metric not about crime? Is it about terrorism? So, these things cook up all sorts of questions. So if you can, help us understand in a nutshell, how do we get to define this and how do we get to produce this list?
Sure. No, that's quite happy to do that. So if we look at it, there are 3 different domains which we measure, and they have 23 different composite indicators. So the first dimension's internal safety and security. So that measures things like the level of violent crime, the homicide rates, the availability of small arms, incarceration rates, number of police, number of terrorist attacks, state-sponsored terror, and other such things. The 3 domains is internal and external conflict, and that's probably self-evident. And the final one is militarisation. Now, we look at the structure of the index. It gets derived from a definition which is the absence of violence or fear of violence. And we have an international expert committee which oversees it, which consists of experts in peace and statistics who then determine what indicators we use, the weight of those indicators. The sources of the information we get aren't our own judgments. We do construct a couple of the indicators, but it's mainly sourced from the best sources we can available globally.
People would understand why Afghanistan, Syria, South Sudan, these are at the bottom of the list because terrible wars are happening in these places. Yemen, for example. I guess they'd also understand why a place like Iceland is fairly peaceful, no internal conflicts, quite remote, and so on. But when the report comes out, and a part of the extrapolation and interpretation is that the world in general is getting more peaceful. They look at the news cycle, and part of our job is to only report on the problems and the terrible things, right? They find it hard to believe that the world is actually a more peaceful place than it was last year. Is that a surprising interpretation?
Look, no, I don't think it is, because if we go back to 2014, and the index has been dropping every year since then up until this year, It was really on the back of the rise of ISIS, the way it then unleashed its terror through Iraq and then moved on in through Syria. And what we've seen over the last 18 months is pretty much the territorial defeat of ISIS. We can also see there's 13% less deaths from conflict in Syria, let's say, and that's the reason that Syria has moved up. Afghanistan really hasn't changed in terms of wars, but Syria is just slightly more peaceful. Now, to put it in context, if we look around the globe, what we'll find is that peace improved just very slightly, very, very slightly. But when you look at it, we found that 86 countries did improve, while 76 dropped. If we look at the news cycles, we've always, and that's the nature of the news, is to focus on quite often the problems of the world and occasionally small blessings which we get. But if we go back over the last decade, we find that peace has dropped 3.7%.
Right.
And over that period of time, we've had 81 countries become more peaceful and 81 countries deteriorate. So we look at those long-term trends. What we'll find, the things which have really caused the deterioration have been really wars in the Middle East. That's particularly Iraq and Syria. Then the knock-on effects from that with the refugees and then the terrorism which ISIS spread and Turkey has certainly suffered from.
Yeah. Any shining examples of those small blessings that you mentioned? Any countries that are rapidly going up?
Yes. Well, what we find is quite often after the back of a conflict, you find that there's already big drops in peace. You find there'll be increases. So we're looking this year. Sudan was one of the ones which did increase, but the cut-off date was before. It was the 31st of March, which was before the recent unrest. And Egypt also, after the series of issues which it's had over the last 5 years, it's bounded quite a bit too. But if we go right to the top of the index, probably the standout there is Bhutan. So if we go back over the last 13 years, it's increased 43 places on the index to now stand at number 15.
Yeah, so part of your statistics here say that violence is costing the world more than $14 trillion a year, and that number equates to 11.2% of world economic activity. I wonder, when you put out that figure, what are you trying to tell people?
Well, what I'm trying to say is that the cost of violence to the global economy is significant. If we can reduce that, that then frees up economic wealth, which can then be put into other areas, which can then stimulate and improve the global economy. So so violence comes with an economic cost. And one of the things which I think is really important with the index, we're not making moral judgments about where countries stand. Yes, let's face it, you border Syria, you're going to get a lot of very nasty spillover effects.
Right. Because
you need a big military.
Right, of course. Because you're going to, sorry to interrupt you, but you're going to get people who say, yes, it's all well and good. I'd love to use that money to build schools and hospitals and put it into education and so on, but I'm fighting a terrorist group. Let the less bad guys defeat the more bad guys first, and then we'll put that money to good use. So with that in mind, I guess you're never expecting to go out of business anytime soon, are you?
Look, I don't think any of us can actually imagine a world which is absolutely peaceful. Hasn't existed in history, doesn't do now, but we can all probably imagine a world which could be 10% more peaceful. Now, if you look at that, that's about $1.4 trillion. Now, $1.4 trillion is the size of all foreign direct investment last year, or put it another way, it's the size of the total economies of, let's say, Ireland, Denmark and Switzerland. So these are large amounts of money. Even 1% of the cost of violence to the global economy is $140 billion, and that's the size of all overseas developmental aid.
Steve Killalay, good to talk to you on the Newsmakers. Thanks for joining us. Every morning before sunrise, Indians pray for rain as they queue up to wait for drinking water. Several parts of the country are running dry as drought is once again stalking the land. And it's not just small villages that should be concerned. One of India's largest cities, Chennai, has been crippled by water shortages. Several of its reservoirs are empty and nothing flows out of the taps. By 2030, scientists have warned that 40% of the population will have no access to drinking water. That'll be around 500 million people. So how did we get here? And how do we stop it? Plus, is the government taking it seriously enough? Well, let's ask our panel. Joining me now is one of the world's leading water experts, Asit Biswas. He's the co-founder of the Third World Center for Water Management. Saravanan Thiagarajanan is in Bengaluru. He's the founder of Waikau Lake, a non-governmental organization trying to revive dying lakes in Tamil Nadu. And in the city of Pune is Chetan Pandit. He's a former member of India's Central Water Committee. Gentlemen, good to have you on the program. Asit Biswas, first of all, paint the big picture for us. Just how catastrophic is this that these two things are happening at the same time? You have climate change, which means that the glaciers feeding the rivers are drying up or receding. And on the other hand, there's groundwater depletion. The two things happening at the same time. Just how serious is this?
Well, up to about 2060, India actually is gaining from the glaciers melting. So the flow in the rivers is higher, will be higher till about 2060 because of the glacier melt, which are going to disappear as the glacier continues to melt. So actually, India is having a much better time in terms of water resources availability because of the increased glacier melt. Now, if you go beyond 2060, we are going to see very serious problem. Population is increasing. By 2050, India's population will be, according to the latest estimate, about 1.7 billion people. Industrialization will increase. Urbanization will increase. So unless India's water management is dramatically improved for agriculture, industrial, and domestic services, India is going to see, according to my forecast I made last year, at least 10 major metropolitan cities are going to run out of water before 2030.
Okay.
So India is facing a very serious problem.
Certainly. Right. So this is fascinating. So just to be absolutely clear, so it's interesting. So you have the glaciers receding, they're feeding the rivers, and at the moment, that's a good thing for the short term, but long term, that's a big problem. And for the short term with the groundwater issue, that's a massive issue because we're looking at the satellite images and these dams are just, withering away and disappearing. If I had to ask you directly,
and
are the leaders to blame for that when we look at the groundwater depletion? Is it directly man-made?
It is completely 100% man-made because of the poor policies that have been put from about 1960. So those are, situation is getting worse. Right now, India is using more groundwater than USA and China combined. And this is not sustainable. The droughts have been very significant, and the latest suggestions from the Niti Aayog saying they should use solar pump will even aggravate the problem, not solve the problem. So this is the problem. One hand, they're trying to do something. Other hand, they're making the problem even worse. So the policy consistency leaves much to be desired, and that is the main Achilles heel in India. The policies for the last 50 years has not been right for a sustainable water development, and politicians, both at the center and at the state, have completely neglected water. They're interested in water when there's a flood and drought. So tomorrow rain comes, their interest will disappear.
Chetan,
we cannot solve the country's water problem.
Right. Chetan Pandit, that's a scathing criticism of the politicians and how they've mismanaged the issue from a man who knows what he's talking about. As somebody who was in the system, involved in trying to fix this issue, why have they got it so wrong?
In a democracy, you cannot put all the blames only on the leaders or only on the people. Finally, there is a price to be paid for the democracy, and the leaders will often try to do what the people want them to do. But at the same time, it is also true that a very wrong notion has been created by the civil society then the groundwater aquifer can be recharged, and recharging the groundwater aquifer, artificial recharge, will bring the groundwater levels back to its original level. Now that's completely untrue. Like in any reservoir or any storage device, for the level or the storage to increase, your output from the or your offtake from the storage must be less than your intake, and that's not happening. Everywhere people are drilling bore wells as deep as they want, taking away as much water as they want. This is permitted under a very old 1882 law, which said at that time when the aquifer details and the hydrology was not understood.
I see.
The
Okay.
law says that a man can take off as much water as he
So,
wants.
Chetan, allow me to come in here for a second, right? So you're saying the government can't do miracles, and that, yes, the blame has to be maybe more proportionally, dealt out and meted out across the board. And while that may be true, and while maybe the government and the politicians are getting an unfair rep, when we had the parliament discuss this, hardly any politicians showed up a week and a half ago. Hardly any of them showed up. You have one of the worst crises of water in the country's history. We've had these dire forecasts, and I'm glad that Asit Biswas mentioned Niti Aayog, because there's another interesting stat from Niti Aayog, or prediction from Niti Aayog. They say and predict that 21 Indian cities will run out of water by next year. So basically, we have the experts saying this is a water apocalypse. The politicians are saying, well, you can't fully blame us, but we're not even going to show up to Parliament to discuss this. Would you understand why the people would feel that these people don't care?
Well, you see, it's a new government. The elections have just taken place, and the new government is still stabilizing itself. So maybe hereafter you might see some better progress. However, the problem is not how many people show up for a discussion. The real problem is the government prepared to move away from populist decisions and take some hard and harsh steps? And that, at the moment at least, doesn't seem to be happening.
Okay, so give me one hard and harsh step that you would like them to take in order to fix this crisis.
The first and foremost requirement is that instead of this romantic riffraff that water is a community resource and people must manage it as a community, etc., the government must take control of the water resources. If I borrow a paragraph from the water policy of the Bangladesh, it very clearly states that government owns the water, and the government will decide who will use how much water at what time and for what purpose. That kind of control.
India is not a socialist dictatorship, right?
Well, it's not a socialist dictatorship, that's true, but at least the first thing they could do was to take the water out of this 1882 Easement Act, which permits any person to extract as much water as he or she wants from the groundwater aquifer.
Okay.
That kind of thing simply cannot be allowed to continue anymore.
Okay, it's interesting. So you mentioned something that you want done. Saravanan, is that a good idea?
So it needs to be a combination of public and as well as the government. Okay, and so the government has to put strict policies to avoid water being commercialized. It means that water should not be sold. Okay, and that is one thing. And there should be restrictions for borewells. So now, people are extracting water to 1,000 feet and more than that. And strict policies need to be enforced for rainwater harvesting. Right now, the rainwater falls on the terrace, goes to the parking tiles, and then to the ditch, and then to a sewage, and then to the sea. There is no way the water is getting percolated. And this is a serious issue. And, it needs to be a combination effort of government and as well as public.
Mr. Biswas, okay, Mr. Biswas, so Chennai is in a horrible state right now when it comes to water. After Chennai,
yes,
there are predictions, Asit Biswas, that Bangalore will be next and other cities. Are they going to keep on falling like dominoes and running out of water until drastic changes are made, Asit Biswas?
I'm afraid until there is a major crisis, either because of lack of quantity or because of water pollution is so severe in virtually all the Indian water bodies near centers of pollution, we'll have an endemic health crisis. Unless there is a real crisis which makes the politicians sit up and put water at the top of at least on the priority agenda, I don't think very much is going to happen. So it seems to me, India will avoid only after a major crisis occurs, which makes the industry say they have not much water to continue. Agriculture say there is not enough to produce food, and the people have not enough to drink. Until that crisis comes, I don't see any future or anything serious happening except some band-aid plans for doing some minor things.
Asid, describe what kind of crisis you feel might be necessary, or that's the wrong word. What kind of crisis would necessitate elected parliamentarians to show up to Parliament to discuss solving the water issue? What kind of crisis are you talking about?
It could come from two sources. First, we are now talking of Chennai and a few small and a lot of villages in Maharashtra and other states which are suffering from water. Now, if you have 8 or 10 major cities suffering from water crisis like they had never had before in history, that will make them wake up. If that is combined with a water pollution crisis because of a health disease or endemic disease that hits the people, that will make people wake up. But incremental increase, as we have seen in the past, it does not seem to have any impact on the people. They still, on the politicians, they're still going around saying, oh, elect me, I'll reduce your water prices or make it water free or electricity free. Well, we know what is to be done, but it seems we do not know what is to be done and still get some politicians elected.
Understood.
So that is the real problem.
Understood. Chetan Pandit?
See, it is not exactly that a crisis hasn't taken place. For example, Chennai, which is being mentioned repeatedly. There is already a crisis in Chennai and it's bad enough. How bad more we want it to be? But the problem is, now Chennai is the first city that started with making rainwater harvesting compulsory. Chennai is also the first city that started purchasing groundwater for supply to the city from the farmers on the outskirts of the city. The point is, we are not prepared to accept that all this rainwater harvesting from the rooftop and artificial recharge is not going to solve Chennai's problem. Unless we accept this reality and discard the myth of the soft solution. You know, there is a tendency in the human mind that people like solutions that are soft, inexpensive, so-called environment friendly, etc. But that doesn't work. Solutions which really work are seldom inexpensive. They are always tough. They may not be so much environment friendly. And solutions which are not, which are inexpensive, etc., they don't often work. Chennai will have to reckon with the idea they will have to transport surface water from long distances by pipelines, canals, or whatever means. Unless they keep on insisting with rainwater harvesting to solve their problems or reviving the lakes, it's not going to solve any problem at all.
Saravanan, Chetan's like a bull in a china shop with this. He's saying everybody needs to get real and stop talking nice, cozy philosophy. Do you disagree with him?
So I disagree with him. Let me put your point. You know, if you are trying to, extract water from other places, again, the other places will also face a severe water crisis problem. So it needs to be throughout, the rainwater harvesting needs to be done throughout the cities, and the lakes has to be revived. There are a lot of lakes which has got encroached, and this is the major problem which we see in Chennai. So, the water doesn't stagnate over there because of the encroachment. The encroachment is the big issue I see in Chennai. So there is there should be a mandatory rainwater harvesting pit, and there is a parking tiles on every houses. That needs to be removed, and the water should be percolated over there, or some sort of mechanism it needs to be there. So that's how the rainwater can easily percolate.
Right.
There are subsequent rainfalls. The rainfalls are good.
Right. Asid Biswas, which of the two gentlemen has a better idea for how to solve this?
I think both are partially correct, but the idea that rainwater harvesting is going to solve the water problem of a mega city like Chennai or Delhi or Bengaluru or Hyderabad is not realistic. Let me give you one simple fact about India, which most people do not realize. India is a monsoon country. Virtually every city in India gets nearly 80 to 85% of its rain within 70 to 120 hours, not consecutive, but during the few months of monsoon. It is impossible to harness that immense amount of rainfall at such a short period of time. The gentleman from Bangalore is absolutely correct. Land use planning simply does not exist in India, and water problem cannot be solved without solving the proper land use problem. So blocking up or silting up or filling up all the lakes and the rivers at the same time asking for more water simply does not make sense. So we need to take a look overall, and Chetan's idea to bring water from bigger distances. You cannot solve water problem. Delhi is supposed to have, by the latest UN forecast, 34 million people by 2035. Where is the water come from if you harvest all the water from Delhi? It is impossible. So we have to start thinking of land use planning, bringing water. And one thing neither of these two gentlemen has touched into is efficient water use management. Indians, both in domestic, industrial, and agriculture, using too much water. The current norm is every person in India should have 130 liters of water. Why? There is no logic to it, because cities in Belgium are now using half of that water, and they get water 24/7 clean water. Why does an Indian need 130 liters of water per person per day? It's beyond my comprehension. Agriculture uses 90% of water. You can easily cut 30% of water used from agricultural sector with good policies within the next 5 years without sacrificing yield, in fact increasing the yield. So it's the question of looking at all these issues holistically, and that simply is not happening.
Okay.
That is the real problem we are facing.
Well, it is undoubtedly a crisis, and it's been a good education for me as well on this issue. Asit Biswas, Saravanan Tyagarajan, and Chetan Pandit, I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, Iraq's Prime Minister tells Iranian-backed militias, you're either with us or against us. Will that be enough to bring the fighters into the fold of the National Army? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.